Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our presentation on project management for facility managers. I'm Alexandra Altvater, and I'm the marketing manager here at Dude Solutions. Before we dive into today's webinar, I wanted to go ahead and cover a few housekeeping rules. Firstly, all of your phone lines are muted. If you have questions, just type them in the chat box, and we'll get to those at the end of the webinar. You'll also receive a recording of today's webinar, and it will last no longer than an hour. Now I'm excited to introduce you to our speaker, Dan Lowry. Dan graduated from the University of Oklahoma in 2002 and from Colorado Technical University in 2011 with a Master of Business Administration and Finance. Dan is currently the Director of Facilities for Southern Hills Country Club in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He's a certified project management professional and maintains credentials as a facility management professional through the International Facility Management Association. Dan also belongs to the City and Country Club Council of IFMA and his local IFMA chapter and the local PMI chapter. He joined IFMA in 2014. Dan, thank you so much for joining us today. Please take it away.
Well, thanks. Thanks for that introduction. I appreciate it. Okay, so let's get into this thing. So we're talking about project management. Project management for facility managers. I've been a facility manager for almost a decade now, both through the military. I was in the Army National Guard for 15 years, and then now currently with Southern Hills Country Club. So let's get into this. I like Dilbert, so I'll give you a second to read that. Okay, so if you're wondering why I'm teaching you about project management and why you should listen to me, or why you should even learn about project management, really, if you are an adept project manager, it will greatly set you up for success as a facility manager. It will really help you populate your computerized maintenance management software with Dude Solutions. I use Dude Solutions. I think it's a great program. It ensures that you get started with operations and maintenance on the right foot. Whenever you can have that project management background and you know how that handoff is supposed to go, it just sets you up for success moving on. Once you exit that project lifecycle and you really enter that asset management lifecycle, it just makes for a seamless transition. So that's my spiel on that. Who am I? I am the Director of Facilities at Southern Hills Country Club. And those are my departments that I manage: maintenance, housekeeping, security, and laundry. As I said before, I was in the Army National Guard for 15 years. I got out just this past year. I was a major. I was a plans officer for an engineer battalion here in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. I'm a perpetual student. I love to learn. I love to keep learning, which is kind of like why I like teaching. I like to do these webinars. I do a podcast that I'll show you here in a second. I'm an author. I wrote a book, The Complete Guide to Facility Management. You can see it right there. It got published last fall. It's on Amazon if you want to check it out. It does have a section on project management, so a lot of what I'm talking about is in that book. You can see my two kids over there to the right, Aiden and Jennings. Aiden actually just turned 12 a couple weeks ago after I created this slide, so he's now 12. My beautiful wife Leslie is right there. We are in front of the Spaceship Earth at Epcot. We're huge Disney fans. So that little thing down there to the bottom that says Addicted to the Mouse, that's our Disney podcast that my wife and I do together on Sundays. Okay, so a little bit more about me. I run a website called Learning FM. Obviously, learning facility management is what that's for, and it's really just all about learning kind of the basics of what I call 4 knowledge domains, everything from business, finance, to leadership, to project management, and then obviously operations and maintenance. So feel free to check that site out. Okay, what we're going to talk about today is pretty in-depth, and I'm going to keep this as high level as possible just to keep this conversation kind of flowing. But it does go into a little bit of technical knowledge, so if you have any questions, feel free to ask. But that's our agenda for the day, and then let's get started with it. So as Alexandra said, I am a certified project management professional. That is through the Project Management Institute, which is one of several different project management methodologies that, if you're interested in project management, you can adhere to. I'm going to talk about the top 3 real quick on that chart. So Prince2, Agile, and PMP. In parentheses, it says PMBOK. That is the Project Management Body of Knowledge, and that is through the Project Management Institute. So PMBOK, again, Project Management Body of Knowledge, users of this system find that it has more substantial frameworks for contract management, scope management, and other aspects, which are arguably less robust than you would find in, say, Prince2. However, many users of the PMBOK system find that they are not entirely happy with the way the system tends to limit decision-making solely to project managers, and that sometimes makes it difficult for handing over aspects of the management to other parties and senior managers. With the PMBOK, the project manager can seemingly become the primary decision maker, planner, problem solver, human resource manager, and so on and so forth. Prince2 stands for Projects in a Controlled Environment, and this is a project management program that shares more of the functional and financial authority with senior management, not just the project manager. This program has a focus on aiding the project manager to oversee projects on behalf of an organization's senior management. On the pro side, Prince2 provides a single standard approach to the management of projects, which is why many government and global organizations prefer this option, and it's also favored because of its ease of use. It's very easy to learn, even for those with limited experience. PMBOK, on the other hand, is not that easy to learn. And then there's Agile, which is a more distinct program from PMBOK and Prince2. It's more flexible. It makes it better suited to producing deliverables without the need for substantial changes and reworking. So tasks can be broken down into smaller stages, and this allows for substantial risk reduction through earlier assessment, testing, and analysis. But the main drawback of Agile is that if it's not really fully grasped, the methodology could lead to unattainable expectations. Now, that being said, when we look at, so from here on out, we're going to look at the PMI framework, right? So that PMBOK framework. You can see underneath the PMI logo there is the Project Management Body of Knowledge Guide. That is the 750-plus page book that you can get to help you study for if you want to take the PMP exam, the Project Management Professional exam. There on the screen to the left of that guide are all the prerequisites and what it is. It's a 200 multiple choice question test that you have 4 hours to do, and then you have continual learning every 3 years to keep that up. It is a very worthwhile credential if you really want to get more into project management. It's pretty well respected. There's 2 options to go. You can see under prerequisites, but what I want to highlight is 35 hours of project management education. So what I'm covering today in less than an hour, you cover in 35 hours of very in-depth stuff. So if you just try to open that PMBOK guide and just start reading, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. That 35 hours of education is really pretty helpful if you want to get further in-depth into this. Now, the PMBOK guide is accredited by ANSI, so it has to be updated every 4 to 5 years. So that being said, they just put out this 6th edition. This is brand new. It was just put out in September of last year. And what they did, the major change was they incorporated Agile into the PMBOK system. So Agile, again, is it's really, so project work ranges from definable work to high uncertainty. Definable work projects are characterized by clear procedures that have proved successful on similar projects in the past. And as more definable work is automated, project teams are more and more undertaking higher uncertainty work projects that require these Agile techniques, and that's why they really wanted to start incorporating Agile into PMBOK. Okay, so let's get into it. So what is a project? So a project is defined by 2 really key things. Number 1 is that it's temporary, meaning that it has a defined beginning and a defined end, and therefore it has a defined scope and resources. And then second, a project is unique, meaning that it's not a routine operation, but it has a specific set of operations designed to accomplish a singular goal. So a project team often includes people that don't usually work together, sometimes from different organizations, sometimes across multiple geographies. I could make the argument that a project that was to install something that we do every single day, if that's in a manufacturing plant or a country club, that has a defined beginning and end, but is not unique because we do it all the time, right? So then what is project management? So the PMBOK guide describes the nature of project management processes in terms of the integration between those processes, their interactions, and the purposes they serve. So project management processes are grouped into 5 categories, and those 5 categories are initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, and controlling, and closing. So initiating is the processes that perform to define a new project or a new phase of an existing project by obtaining authorization to start the project of the phase. Planning is just what it sounds like. It's those processes required to establish the scope of the project, refine the objectives that you really want to accomplish, and define the course of action required to attain those objectives. In executing, it's all the processes required to complete the work. Monitoring and controlling, it's the processes required to track, review, and regulate the executing processes. And in closing, it's the processes performed to finalize all activities across all process groups. So, the 5 process groups. You can kind of see there on the right that the 5 process groups are linked by the outputs which are produced. So the output of one process generally becomes an input to another process or is a deliverable in and of itself. For example, the planning process group provides the executing process group with the project management plan and the project documents. And all that is right there in the center of that chart to the right of the picture. The process flow diagram that you're looking at to the right of the picture provides an overall summary of the basic flow and interactions among process groups and specific stakeholders. The project management processes are linked by specific inputs and outputs, where the result of or the outcome of one process becomes the input to another, right? So the process groups are not project lifecycle phases. And what I mean by that is, for instance, monitoring and controlling, you see how it's big, long right there to the right of everything else? That happens during all the phases during the project lifecycle. It's not just the 4th thing that you do, monitor and control the process. It's happening continuously. And if you wonder where I get some of these charts, a lot of these ones that look computer generated are from the PMBOK guide, since that's what we are referencing. Okay, so a little bit more in depth. The initiating process group consists of those processes performed to define a new project or a new phase within an existing project. And what you do is you obtain authorization to start the project or phase. Within the initiating processes, the initial scope is defined and initial financial resources are committed. Your stakeholders, internal and external, who will interact and influence the overall outcome of the project are identified. And if not already assigned, the project manager will be selected. The key purpose of the process group initiating is to align the stakeholders' expectations with the project's purpose, give them visibility of the scope and objectives, and show how their participation in the project and its associated phases can ensure their expectations are achieved. So essentially, you're creating a vision for the project and what needs to be accomplished. In planning, it consists of those processes performed to establish the total scope of effort, define and refine objectives, and develop the course of action required to attain those objectives. The progressive detailing of the project management plan, which is the major output of the planning process group, is called progressive elaboration, indicating that planning and documentation are iterative and ongoing. Again, not limited to just a second phase of a project lifecycle, but ongoing throughout the whole life cycle of the project. The key benefit of the process group of planning is to delineate the strategy and tactics as well as the course of action or path to successfully complete the project or phase. Again, the project management plan, along with the project documents developed as outputs from the planning process group, will explore everything that you have to do within the project, from scope to time to cost to quality to communications, HR, risks, stakeholder engagement, procurements, everything. In executing, The executing process group consists of those processes performed to complete the work defined in the project management plan to satisfy the project specifications. So this process group involves coordinating people and resources. It involves managing stakeholder expectations. It involves integrating and performing the activities of the project in accordance with the project management plan that you got from the planning process group. Monitoring and controlling, again, goes on constantly. It consists of those processes required to track, review, and orchestrate the progress and performance of the project. With this, you're identifying any areas in which changes to the plan are required, and then you initiate those corresponding changes. The key benefit of this process group is that the project performance is measured and analyzed at regular intervals, and you identify variances from the project management plan. And finally, the closing process group. This consists of those processes performed to conclude all activities across all project management process groups to formally complete the project phase or any contractual obligations. This process group, when completed, verifies that the defined processes are complete within all of the processes groups, and it closes the entire project or phase. This process group also formally establishes the premature closure of a project if one should occur. For example, an aborted project, a canceled project, or projects that have some critical situation that just can't continue on. All right, and so that flow chart corresponds, on the right, corresponds to the 47 project management processes on the left. So, project management is accomplished through the appropriate application and integration of 47 logically grouped project management processes, which are categorized into those 5 project management groups. So you can see across the top, initiating through closing, those are your 5 project management groups, and then down the side are 10 separate knowledge areas. A knowledge area represents a complete set of concepts, of terms, of activities that make up a professional field. Those 10 knowledge areas are used pretty much on most projects most of the time, whether or not it's formalized. So project teams should utilize those 10 knowledge areas and other knowledge areas as appropriate, should there be any, for your specific project. I'm not going to read them to you, but you can see those 10 down the side. Now the intersection of those 10 knowledge areas and the project management process groups, those inside the main part of that chart, those are your 47 separate processes. So like the first process is develop a project charter, and that's the intersection of project integration management and initiating process group. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay. Now for something that actually makes sense. So if you were going to pick up the PMBOK guide and start reading, that's everything that you would have seen over several hundred pages. It's really, I don't know that there's a better way to organize it, but it's not really intuitive if you just pick it up and start reading. So hopefully the rest of this webinar will make a little more sense. So we're going to break down project management because this is the easiest way that I wrap my brain around it. I'm a little slower, so I like to put it in a little simpler terms. I wrap up these project management process groups into basically 3 things: the beginning, the middle, and the end. We already defined a project as having a beginning and an end, so it therefore has to have a middle, right? So the beginning would incorporate initiating and planning. The middle, executing, monitoring, controlling, and the end is obviously your closing. Okay, so let's look at it this way. Initiating is answering a clearly defined problem. That's the easiest way to determine what the desired results of the project should be. One tool to do this, and it's what I use, and it's what I used a lot in the military, is to create a problem statement written in the form of a question. And what that looks like is it begins with the words, how can we, and then you fill in the blank. However you choose to do that, you have to first define the problem, then identify the solution, which is what the end state or the end result should look like. Then you can move forward with solving it. So you first have to figure out what your problem is, figure out what the answer is, and then figure out how to get that answer. Now, a common term for a document used to approve a project's existence and authorize the project manager to expend resources is called a project charter. The project charter is the major output of initiation, but to get a project charter, you need a summary of what the project will accomplish, or nobody's going to sign it, right? So, therefore, an input to this step will be the project statement of work, or SOW. The SOW is a narrative explaining the reason for the project. That's what we call the business case. Why are we doing that? That's the business case. It's also going to include the end result. We identified that already, right? So the end result is going to be the scope of the product. And then how the project aligns with the overall strategic direction of the organization. So your organization may or may not use the terms project charter, scope of work, but the bottom line is you have to ensure that your project is approved, the proper approvals are in place before you expend any organizational resources on the project. And now that officially approves and initiates the project. And then finally, you want to identify your stakeholders. Now, a stakeholder is anyone who is affected by or can affect your project. Stakeholders can be individuals, they can be groups, they can be organizations. The key is to be sure to really analyze who this project could affect and who could have an effect on it. Now you should make a list, make a stakeholder register of everybody that can affect or affect your project. Now you can always cross somebody off your list later on if you've put too many people on it, but it's really hard to go back at a later date and ask for input from somebody that should have been on your stakeholder list that you maybe left off. Okay, let's talk about planning. So there are two types of project triangles that I have come to learn and appreciate over the years. The first is something that I've reminded my current boss of several times. It's the one there on the left. You can pick two of any of those 3 points within your project, but you can't have all three with good, fast, and cheap. To get your results done well and fast, it will cost substantially more than if you're willing to wait. If budget is your primary concern, you can choose quality or speed. Now, every so often you may get lucky and get all three, but that's absolutely the exception, and you should be wise to not plan on it. Then you have the other project triangle to the right. That triangle is probably the more universally accepted version of the project triangle because the first one, while it is absolutely true, it's a bit tongue-in-cheek. The quality triangle is, if you notice, an equilateral triangle. And that's symbolic because if all sides are of equal length, that signifies that each one of those corners has equal weight and is of equal importance of the cornerstones of planning. Those are scope, schedule, and cost. So as a project manager and you undertake a project, equal emphasis must be placed on all three of those cornerstones. If one leg starts to waver, i.e. the schedule starts to slip or cost overruns begin to occur, the triangle is no longer equilateral and quality absolutely suffers. The only way to ensure that stakeholders' expectations are met at the end of the project is to manage all three of those cornerstones during the entire project lifecycle. So the first thing to plan in planning is that big red circle. That is the project management plan, and it's all-encompassing, right? It's an overarching plan, and it should be tailored to your specific project and team. It will define how the project is executed, supervised, and controlled. It can be a high-level summary, or it can be a very, very detailed document that encompasses subplans for each knowledge area. And so what you're looking at is a graphic that shows an overarching project management plan, and each one of those circles inside of it, scope management plan, time management plan, cost management plan, quality management plan, all of those are the subplans that you could include in the overarching project management plan. So delving into planning, we want to plan those three major cornerstones. So we're going to start with scope. So the outcome of planning scope will be the scope statement. The scope statement includes several things, but first is the scope itself. And what that is a description of work to be accomplished and desired outcomes. The statement also includes deliverables required and the acceptance criteria that must be set. Statements about any exclusions can also be included in the scope statement. And then finally, any assumptions or constraints can also be included in the scope statement. Then from there, you want to develop the project schedule. Now on the surface, developing a project schedule might sound fairly straightforward. However, the first time you ever put one together, you will understand how complex it can become. To build a schedule from the ground up, you must first dissect or decompose the entire project into smaller, more manageable, bite-sized pieces. The first thing to do is to create what we call a work breakdown structure, and that's what that graphic is right there, a WBS, or a work breakdown structure. The WBS is nothing more than a hierarchy where the top level is the entire project, and it is broken down into tasks, subtasks, and finally work packages, which is the lowest level of the WBS. The purpose is to break down an entire project into these work packages, which can be estimated and then managed for schedule and budget. So you could also include, you probably should if there's some unclear terminology, a work breakdown dictionary, and that's going to have detailed information about each component, so like descriptions, milestones, responsible personnel, cost estimates, etc. The next step in the scheduling process is to create an activity list, and you can see that at the very bottom to the right underneath one of those work packages. Now, an activity list further breaks down a work package into basically individual activities. You can see the hierarchical structure of the decomposition, and once you have all of your activities listed, you have to do three things. First, you have to sequence them. You have to put them in order in which you intend to accomplish them. Second, you have to estimate how long each activity will take to complete, and that is called the activity's duration. And then, that's going to be important because if activity 1 has to be completed before activity 2 can start, you can't put activity 2 on an overall project schedule until you know how long it's going to take to complete activity 1, right? And then third, you're going to want to estimate what you need to accomplish each activity, and those are your resources that are required. So that's important because you not only have to schedule how long the activities take to accomplish, but you also have to schedule lead time for obtaining any of those resources that you need, so building materials, permits, etc., that kind of stuff. And those are going to be required to begin the activity. Now, once you have all this information, you can put that together and create your schedule. So how do you create a schedule? Well, there are three basic scheduling techniques: forward pass, backward pass, and critical path. So to use forward pass, the project manager simply sequences activities in order from a given start date to determine what the completion date will be. So if you don't have a set completion date and it's not important, timeline isn't that important, you might use forward pass because it's fairly easy. The second is backward pass. So backward pass is scheduling when the project manager begins at a set completion date, and you work backward from that point to determine what the start date should be. So if you know I have to be complete on August 1st, that's your hard date, is your completion date, and then you work backwards to figure out that, well, I need to start by May 1st, or I need to start by April 1st, whatever it is. And then finally is the most widely accepted one, which is called the critical path method, or CPM. This technique uses what we call critical path analysis to determine dependencies between activities. Then, critical path method arrives at the shortest possible completion time total for the entire project. That sequence of dependent activities that form the shortest possible completion time is what we refer to as the critical path. Because if any one of those activities along that critical path is delayed, then the entire project is delayed. And so the way that you come up with this is through critical path analysis. So when we talk about scheduling tools, now we're going to talk about what you're actually looking at on the right side of the screen. So critical path analysis is a tool that combines activities and their durations into a flow chart based on their dependencies. The flow chart is commonly referred to as a precedence diagram or an activity on node diagram, and that's that top right graphic right there. So think of each activity node as its own little icon in the overall flow chart. So each one of those little rectangles is an activity node. Within each node, the PM writes all information about the activity's schedule, including the activity's name, the duration, the early start, the late start, the early finish, the late finish, and the total float. Total float is the amount of time an activity can be delayed from its early start date without delaying the project finish date. All the information is listed, other than the name obviously, is listed numerically, like in whole numbers, and it represents a period of time, and that's typically going to be in days on longer projects. So if you look, you see the little start circle, and the first node, the activity name is A, and then the early start is day 1. The duration is 5 days, so the early finish is day 5. Then the late start is day 1 because it's the first activity we're doing, so we're not going to start it any later than day 1. The total float is 0 because it's the only thing on the critical path, because it's the only activity that's being done so far. And then the late finish is 5. So I could spend hours on this, but I encourage you to look up the critical path method and critical path analysis. Now, once you have your schedule, talk about a scheduling tool called schedule compression. So this is a tool for project managers to decrease the total duration of a project by shortening the time it takes to accomplish individual activities. There's 2 ways to do it, 2 ways to compress a schedule. You can crash it or you can fast track it, and each one has its own drawback. Crashing is simply adding resources to decrease activity duration. For instance, if I frame a house in 7 days with 5 framers, I might be able to frame it in 5 days if I up the framers to 8, if I have 8 framers. I do save 2 days, but I incur the added labor cost for the 3 additional framers over the entire 5-day period. Fast tracking, on the other hand, is taking activities that were planned to be performed in sequence and doing them concurrently, so at the same time. You got to be careful with that one, though. So while you're not adding additional resources in the form of cost by personnel or whatever it is, it does increase your risk exposure. There was a reason that it was supposed to be done in sequence rather than at the same time. And then lastly, we'll talk about graphical analysis. So graphical analysis is basically models and charts that can make relatively easy graphical representations of the project schedule that all stakeholders can understand. The most common is the Gantt chart, and that's what you're looking at right there with the blue bars. The Gantt chart, spelled G-A-N-T-T, is typically created with a project management software. It's a bar chart that depicts the project schedule, any dependent relationships and milestones, as well as the critical path and the activity list in one overview. Another model is called the Program Evaluation and Review Technique, or PERT. That was developed by the Navy in the 1950s. It's very similar to the civilian critical path model, but I personally prefer the Gantt chart because it's easier for me to explain to any stakeholders who do not routinely engage in project management where we are, what has to be done, and what activities are dependent on things that are currently being done in the project. So moving on, so we've talked about planning scope and planning schedule. Now we're going to talk about planning the budget real quick. So the first step in creating a project budget is to generate cost estimates. And again, this is why I use that work breakdown structure and you decompose everything to its smallest possible component because that's also easier to estimate. Now there are different methods of estimating cost and different reasons you would use each of the following methods. When deciding which one to use, choose the method that yields the most accurate cost estimate based on the information that you have. So the first one is historical estimating. This is also known as analogous estimating. And what it does is it takes the known cost from a similar project that somebody has already performed in the past and adjusts them accordingly, like say for inflation. And then that generates an estimate for the current project. So when I got out of college, I was a home builder. And I knew that based off of past data, so if I built a floor plan 6 months ago, that I knew, depending on what construction prices had done in the last 6 months, if I was going to build it again, that I could adjust for rising or lowering construction costs or any other costs, and I could get a fairly accurate estimate that way. The second way of estimating is parametric estimating. This method uses rate relationships between costs and variables. So again, back to my house building example, a cost per square foot would be an example of parametric estimating. And then finally is bottom-up estimating. That's the most accurate, but it also takes the most time, and it also should be used as information and time allows. So bottom-up estimating is just exactly what it sounds like. It's simply taking the lowest level of work known at the time, so your activity or work package, whatever the lowest level that you have, and then you generate a cost estimate for each. And then at the end, you just add them all up together, and that's your overall project estimate. Now once you have your cost estimate for the project, then you want to create your budget. So that's the next step, and you basically compile all those cost estimates and you add contingency reserves to it, and that creates what we call the cost baseline. That cost baseline is what you use during the execution phase to measure, supervise, and control actual costs of the project. The only thing the baseline does not contain is what we call management reserves. So the cost baseline plus the management reserves make up the total project budget. So the difference between the two, contingency reserves are the funds set aside to allow a project manager to mitigate risks. So basically you can determine it by a percentage, or if you actually know what your risks are, you can calculate a number and stick it in there. But something like this might be, if you know you're doing some excavating and you know there's rock in the area, you're going to put some contingency reserves because you know it's a possibility that you're going to hit some rock. That is what we call managing or mitigating known risk. The likelihood of a negative impact on the project, it means that you have forecasted that and accepted that. Now management reserves, on the other hand, are funds that are set aside to mitigate unidentified or unknown risk, and those are controlled above the project manager's head by senior management, and they can be used how they see fit. And that's why the total project budget consists of all cost estimates, contingency reserves, and management reserves. However, the cost baseline that the PM is responsible for and what the PM uses to supervise and control the project does not include the management reserves. Okay, so all of that being said, we're going to wrap up planning. However, I'm going to bring you back to this image because we just talked about those three cornerstones in that quality management triangle: scope, time, and cost. So the scope management plan, the time management plan, and the cost management plan. Those are 3 of the 9 circles within that project management plan. So there's still a lot to plan here. So there's still a lot to consider. But by far, cost, time, and scope is going to be what you spend most of your time on. Okay, so let's move on to executing. So we're into the middle. You know, we got the beginning, the middle, and the end. So the execution of the project is driven by the scope and statement of work, the contracting documents, and all of the work put into the planning process, creating the project management plan. So as the project manager, you'll be responsible for managing all of the work to ensure deliverables are produced according to the contract, the schedule, and the budget. Talking about submittals, I'm sure submittals are shop drawings, samples, or data on materials and products submitted by the contractor or subcontractors as a check and balance to verify that the correct type and quantity of products are used during the project itself. So these are typically submitted from a contractor or a subcontractor through either a designer, an architect, or an engineer to the owner's representative. And as facilities folks, I assume that's who you are. That's the role that I play. I'm the owner's representative as the project manager. And during this process, the submittal can be approved, returned for change or clarification, or just all out rejected. Regardless, however, the submittal must eventually be approved before it is included into the project work. And then finally, in executing, you're going to see a lot of requests for information, or RFIs, and that's exactly what it sounds like. All it is a request for information. It's a question. What you need to know about RFIs, though, is that you have to follow a process, or you're going to get lost in them. So there should be a standard form used for any RFI that everyone should fill out and follow, and then those should be recorded in a register, and the same person or persons should be responsible for processing the RFIs every time. That is because the quicker and more accurate the information on the response is, the better the outcome will be. And then it's really important to create that record for clarification. So this has come in handy many times when a contractor has installed an incorrect product. Maybe it was the wrong color, or maybe it was put in the wrong location or something, and they did not seem to recall being told otherwise. If they had asked that question beforehand and you had written it down on an RFI, you could pull that out and show it to them, and they would have to fix it. So furthermore, in the executing process group, you're going to deal with changes. One major challenge is how to process that change request. A change request is a formal appeal to modify contract documents, deliverables, or a baseline. Now, once a change request is approved, that now takes the place of the original project component. So if you modify a baseline with a change request, that's the new baseline. There are 4 types of change requests. You've got corrective action, which changes something that's already been done that went badly. You've got preventative action, which is similar to corrective action but ensures future work aligns with the project management plan. You've got a defect repair. That's a change to modify a component of or the product itself that does not conform to specifications. And then you have an update, which is a change to a formal project document to reflect updates in the project. And then I want to touch on FF&E real quick because this is something that can get overlooked. What that stands for is furniture, fixtures, and equipment. It refers to any movable furniture, fixtures, and equipment that do not have a permanent connection to your facility. FF&E may or may not be included in a scope with a general contractor, but most projects do. If it's a large project, they do contain some form of FF&E component to them. So as the PM, just understand who's responsible for selecting, procuring, and installing the FF&E, and ensure that it's accounted for early. There's nothing worse than having a nice, brand new, empty building because somebody forgot to order the office furniture. And then let's talk about managing the project team real quick. So part of the execution process is obviously managing your team once you assemble them. Assuming you're the acting project manager, obviously the first thing you do is put your team together. That can be a challenge, especially if you've never worked together before. One tool to assist you in that is by using an organizational hierarchy that graphically depicts who's working with and for who. And then another tool is you can use a RACI chart specific to the project team members, and the PM can assign responsibilities of who's responsible, accountable, and who needs to be informed or consulted. In 1963, the graphic you're looking at, Bruce Tuckman proposed a model of group development. Commonly referred to as the Tuckman ladder, it describes 4 stages that went into 5, and those are the stages in front of you. It's just important to understand the common process from forming, coming together, to storming, where you're showing individuality and hostility maybe toward each other, to norming, where you're really starting to work well together, and into performing, and then adjourning when you're closing the project. Okay, monitoring and controlling. So we're going to talk about this real quick. The process of supervising and controlling the project work is absolutely one of the most important aspects of project management. That's where a project management team will monitor, review, and report the progress of all project objectives contained in the project management plan. And the way you do that is you use your baselines: cost, schedule, and scope. In addition to monitoring the scope to ensure deliverables meet the minimum requirements, the project manager must pay attention to any deliverables going above and beyond the requirements. So underneath monitoring and controlling scope, we're going to talk about scope creep and gold plating. 2 examples of the scope getting out from under you. Scope creep is the uncontrolled scope growth during a project when no changes are made with formal change requests. For example, consider a customer engaging with a developer in a website project. The customer asks the project manager if he can add 1 extra feature that was not called for in the scope baseline. Wanting to be a nice project manager, they say sure, but maybe something goes wrong, and because they added that 1 extra feature, a developer has to spend days and days rewriting lines of code because there was a compatibility issue. Now who pays for it? Gold plating, on the other hand, is when a project manager, not the customer, the project manager or the project team adds a feature that nobody requested and that was also not included in the scope baseline. It's always done with good intentions because they think that they are adding value to the customer's deliverable, and they're not even charging them for it. I mean, who can lose? But a lot of times customers just don't want it, or they would have asked for it in the first place, and they're going to make you lose the cost from adding it and then lose the cost from going back and doing it how they wanted it done in the first place. For all baselines, especially cost and schedule, the PM can use what we call earned value management, and that's going to combine the scope, the schedule, and cost measurements to form what we call a performance measurement baseline. I'm going to show you a graphic on that here in a second. This is important because understanding how to track and report costs is vital to ensuring senior management stays informed and you are positioned to respond quickly and appropriately when anything gets out of line. So the most common way to do this is through earned value management. Now, we spent hours and hours and hours on this, learning this and understanding it. So there's no way I'm going to be able to do it in a couple of minutes. But just understand that earned value management, it combines scope, schedule, and cost to determine variances between the baseline and actual performance. So the purple line right there, that's called the planned value. That is going to be your performance management baseline. So that is the combination of all your baselines. Now, in this example in front of you, you see the today line. So across the bottom is time, and across the, if you go on the left-hand side, that's cost. So as time goes along, we're assuming that we're spending more money and we're earning more value as the schedule goes on, and that's why the planned value is rising. Planned value is the authorized budget for the work. As such, planned value is calculated before the work is performed. So that purple line is calculated before anything starts. That is the value the project should have earned according to the schedule, and that forms the baseline. Don't think of planned value as referring only to budgeted costs. It also refers to schedule. So that's why you've got the earned value, the yellow line there, and the actual cost, the green line. So the difference between the planned value and the yellow line, that's your schedule variance, and the schedule variance, what you've earned, the earned value, and the green line is going to be your cost variance. So for instance, say you've got 5 weeks to create 5 widgets. So we're going to create 1 widget per week for 5 weeks, and each widget costs $1,000. Let's say, so at the end of week 1, we should have earned $1,000 of value and spent $1,000. And that would mean if we have 1 widget at the end of that week, that would mean that the green line, the purple line, and the yellow line would all be on top of each other. However, let's say at the end of week 2, we only have 1 widget that cost us $1,500 instead of $1,000. That's where you start getting these lines that are off from each other. So the green line on the today, vertical today line would represent $1,500. The planned value would represent $2,000, and then or $1,000, and then the yellow line would represent $2,000 because we should be a week past where we're at. I hope that makes sense. Everything to the in the bulleted list, those are all just computations that you can figure out. So for instance, cost variance is equal to the earned value minus the actual cost, and that's your cost variance, right? So if earned value is below on your chart, cost variance, then you're going to have a negative. Okay. Monitoring and controlling. So I know we have a lot of manufacturing folks on the line today, so you're probably pretty familiar with quality assurance and quality control, but real quick, think of quality assurance as process improvement. QA is done by a separate department that audits, typically a separate department that audits operations as they are performed. The point of the quality audit is to objectively measure processes and how they are implemented. There's a lot of different tools for quality assurance. The PMBOK guide lists the 7 basic tools of quality if you want to look into some of those. Quality control, on the other hand, is the process of measuring deliverables against the requirements in the scope. Tools such as inspections, examinations, etc. are used to quote-unquote QC deliverables to determine if they meet the scope requirements. And that's considered a validation of project deliverables. Bottom line, methods for Q and QC should be spelled out as part of the project management plan when planning quality management. And then the last thing is commissioning. So once a new system is procured and installed, it should be commissioned if you have that as an option. So commissioning is the process of testing, adjusting, verifying, and documenting that the asset functions in accordance with the specifications. This process will establish the correctly functioning system as a benchmark for future operation, and it provides the owner with documentation, so like O&M manuals, and training of how to do it. This process is focused on quality and can be used in different building systems such as mechanical, life safety, utilities, controls, etc. If nothing else, I always try to commission large HVAC installations, and it should be done with the help of a commissioning authority who is contracted by the owner directly, not through the contractor, because that would be a conflict of interest. And then finally, we've got our closing process group. So this is going to be the end in our beginning, middle, and end of the project life cycle. And we're going to do several things within closing. We're going to conduct a final inspection. So hopefully, as a project manager, you're going to be conducting periodic walkthroughs and routine inspections of the progress of the project work up to this point. So you have controlled the work up to this point. You have managed your change requests, and you have supervised your baselines. At this time, there really shouldn't be any major surprises with regard to quality or contract performance. The final inspection really should be quite simple and quick if you've been doing all this up throughout the project. What you're really doing is conducting a validation that all contract specifications and change orders have been accomplished and that all punch list items are complete. Therefore, in my opinion, two things must be done prior to final inspection. First, you must create a punch list, and second, you have to do agree on a substantial completion date. So the punch list is you do a final walkthrough with all the necessary stakeholders for the purpose of creating this list that lists out everything that has to be done so that you can close out the project. Substantial completion is what you need to determine on when you will accept the deliverable, which means you take responsibility for it. So like if it's a building, it means you're going to move into the space, even though there may still be things left on the punch list before you officially close out the entire project. The point is that when a majority of the project is done and only minor things are left, say there has a little component got ordered wrong and it doesn't affect the usability or the occupation of the building, but it's going to take 6 weeks to get, you're not going to put off moving into the building until that's done. Then you want to close out all the contracts. Now that may seem obvious, but don't overlook it. Once you've accepted substantial completion, it's easy to move on to the next project and forget about the lingering details of the current one. Just make sure once everything is done and the final inspection has been passed, just close out any open contracts. It should be done by formally signing a document stating that the contract is closed and approving the final payment to the contractor. And then the last thing you're going to do is release your team. You should make this a formal process, and you should recognize any outstanding efforts of individuals and the success of the entire project team. So I know that a lot of that was really quick, and again, we tried to squeeze in about 35 hours of education into a 1-hour time block. So if you'd like to get more information from me or from Dude Solutions, Alexander, do you want to, the survey, feel free to fill that out.
Yep, exactly. So if anybody wants more information from Dan or from us, please feel free to mark your response here. And while you're doing that, if anybody has any questions, I know I saw some hands raised, feel free to type those questions into the chat box, and then we can have Dan answer one or two here before we hit the end of the hour. So, Dan, we do have one question, and the question is, how do you know which project management methodology you should be using as a facility manager?
So project management methodology is kind of like how do you know which track to take when you're figuring out which career to go down. I started with PMI. It was something I was more comfortable with. I really like the structure of it. Being in the military, that's when I was doing projects in the military, that is the methodology that we used, and it just fit my personality. I would suggest looking at maybe just a little more in depth on those different methodologies. The three that I went over are the most popular. I think the fact that PMI is now incorporating Agile into their methodology is kind of a big benefit there. But I'd say once you learn it and once you live it and once you use it, I wouldn't switch between them. That just is too complicated. I'd say pick one, stick with it, learn it, and then that's what you're going to use over and over again.
Okay, great. Would you also mind resharing what the URL was for your website for folks to be able to go on there and get some more tidbits of your wisdom?
Yeah, absolutely. It's learningfm.com. Learning, F as in facility, M as in management. There's blog posts on there. There are some links to some things, and then I do a weekly podcast that you can. It's also Learning FM. You can find it on iTunes or Stitcher, wherever. But it's also on there as well. The learningfm.com.
Wonderful. Looks like we have another question. What is the best way to learn and understand more about earned value management?
Yeah, so I wish I had more time to really explain that in greater depth. I know I was rushing past it because one of my eyes was on the clock here. So you can just go to Google. If you don't want to buy the PMBOK and you just want to go to Google, by all means, just type in earned value management, and you can find several really good articles about it that go into more depth, and it will explain the like I said, each one of those bulleted items, those represented a different calculation. And just looking at the calculation, and it takes a little bit of time to look at the chart and figure out graphically what you're trying to explain. But the calculations will help you populate that chart. And then that graph, that chart, is what you can use to explain to stakeholders where you're at in the project. So obviously cost variance, schedule variance, you're going to come up with a number. And it's like, we are over budget by this number, we are under budget by this number. And then there's also a cost or a schedule variance ratio or an index. Same thing with cost, and it'll be, again, a ratio. If it's above 1.0, then you're doing great. If it's below 1.0, you're not doing so great. And then how to figure out as the project goes along, how to get the project back on track, back in line with the performance management baseline. And really the best thing I would say to do is just go to Google, type in earned value management, and just start reading a couple of those articles, and it'll start to make a little more sense.
Wonderful. Thank you. Other than that, I think that's all the questions we have coming in here. So if anybody has any more, feel free to type them in, and we can get back to you individually. Dan, thank you so much for your time today.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.